Thank you, Antonia. We want to thank all of you for joining today's session, which is Navigating Ethical Roles in the Juvenile Healing to Wellness Court. The Tribal Youth Resource Center is a cooperative partner of the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention, and we do envision a future where Indigenous youth thrive through traditional lifeways. We always like to open our sessions in a good way, and so today we would like to open with a short activity for all of you who have joined us today. Just want to share in a couple of minutes of just collaborative positivity for this session. So we know that there are very strong links between a positive attitude and our outlook on life, and just for our own benefit, for our health, for the outcomes for ourselves and for our communities. And so I would invite you today, as part of our opening, to type in the chat and share a positive word if you need to Google, but one positive word with the same letter as your first name. And so I'm going to be typing into the chat. I invite my co-facilitators today to type in the chat, but share the first letter of your first name, a positive word. And if you would like to, while you're doing that, if you would like to share who you are, where you're joining from, what community you are here on behalf of, if you are currently working or serving or a partner of a wellness court, please let us know. We'd love to know who's in the room. And we always wish we were working together in person, but it's nice to know who's in this virtual room with us. I'm seeing a lot of great words already. So I see fantastic. Thank you so much, Felicia. Terrific from Tanya. Determined from Deidre. Thank you. Laura, love. Danita, determined also. Celeste, collaborative. I'm loving all these. Jonelle, justice. Donna, driven. Lenora, love. Christy, thank you so much for letting us know where you're joining from. I see beautiful, courageous. Thank you so much. Caroline, I see care. I'm going to go for about 15 more seconds because I know we have a lot to talk about today. Savvy, that's a great one. I was going to add abundance. And we can go ahead and go to the next slide. Victorious, that is a wonderful word. Magnificent. Okay, I'm loving all of these shared words. Thank you all so much for sharing a word today and opening us up in a good way. I would like to share that we are talking today about ethics. And so I wanted to start with a positive word because we know that this can be a very heavy topic. And we are so privileged to have a wonderful presenter today, the Honorable Judge Carrie Garrow. She is joining us. And we are so thrilled that she could be giving of her time to present today. And so Judge Garrow received her undergraduate degree from Dartmouth College, her law degree from Stanford Law School, and she holds a master's in public policy from the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. She has worked as a visiting assistant professor and as the executive director of the Center for Indigenous Law, Governance, and Citizenship at Syracuse University College of Law. In addition to serving as chief judge of the St. Regis Mohawk Tribal Court, she serves as a consultant to the Tribal Law and Policy Institute and has had the opportunity to travel to numerous Indian nations and provide training to tribal courts. She has co-authored numerous publications, including the recent Tribal Criminal Law and Procedure, second edition with Sarah Deer, and she has many other articles that she has written that have contributed to the field, not only to wellness courts, but tribal justice systems on the whole. So I just want to thank Judge Garrow for giving her time today, being a part of this session. We can go to the next slide. And I'll have our co-facilitator of the Tribal Youth Resource Center introduce himself.
Good afternoon, good morning, everyone. My name is Jacob Mathoxon. I'm Oneida from Wisconsin, and I serve as a technical assistant here for the TYRC. I'm an attorney licensed in New Mexico. I previously worked in New Mexico prosecuting. So I'm excited for the conversation today. I think ethics is really relevant, and obviously Judge Garrow is a master in her field. So we'll move on to the next slide and talk a little bit about an overview of the ethics and our discussion happening today.
All right. Thank you, Anna. Thank you, Jacob. It's an honor to be here. And the picture they showed of me, that's like the deer in the headlights look that I get when they're like, "Oh, we want you to talk about ethics." Yeah, I was just thinking this morning, I did not start out my career thinking that, oh yes, I'm going to end up talking about ethics and teaching ethics. In law school, I actually hated that class because there's no bright line. But we're going to talk about ethics, why we need ethics. We're going to talk about confidentiality rules. We'll talk a little bit about the different rules for team members and how we work within these rules. We'll talk a little bit about confidentiality, and we hopefully will get to family involvement in healing to wellness court. But as you heard in the introduction, this is part 1 of part 2. So it could very well be, we won't get to all these things. And we hope that you'll participate in the chat. I was scrolling through, seeing through the participants, seeing who's here. And I'm excited to see some friends in the audience. And we have a great group here. If we were in person, we'd all just be sitting around in a circle talking. So I hope that you'll be participating in the chat. And it looks like maybe we're having some PowerPoint difficulties. But thank you for sharing your where you're from and also your words and your roles, because that helps us as well. All right. Just see if we can get the PowerPoint back up. We're actually first, we're going to kick off our discussion. And this is where, right from the beginning, we want audience participation. So if we can go to the next slide. It's talking about why we have ethics. In fact, I know Anna and Jacob, and please jump in. I'm going to pull my chat up too. So why do we have ethical rules? It's funny. I end up, again, not sure how I ended up doing this, but I often end up teaching the ethics at NIJA, which is the judges, Tribal Court Judges Association. And of course we use a lot of funny, although I'm sure it's not funny for the people involved, the examples you see in the news of things, just gone bad. And they're always, at least in my opinion, outrageous. You wonder how judges get themselves in these situations. The one that always pops out is the judge who for some reason thought it was okay to choke one of their court staff, put her hands right around his neck, and oddly enough, then got removed from the bench. But in reality, ethics, a lot of ethical questions are more in the gray area, which is probably why I didn't like it as a law student, because it's hard to, as they tell you when you take the exam, just pick the best answer. There's not a right answer. And so ethics defines for us what is good for us as individuals and the society. And it's really about the nature of duties that we owe ourselves and owe others. But of course, this can change, and this does change depending on what your role is, like what your profession is, what your role on the team, what's your role in the community. But here's why I want you to type in the chat here. What would happen if we had no standard of ethics for our professional duties? How do you think things would go with your juvenile healing to wellness team, or your judges, or your attorneys? What would happen? Just type it in the chat. Seeing, I see so many people from all over. So seeing what clients would not be protected. Lots of inconsistent rulings, absolutely. And clients definitely cause more harm. And we talk about that a lot in our Healing to Wellness, where do no harm. We wouldn't have expectations for each other. Absolutely. Big trouble. Absolutely. Abuse of power. Yes. That's a great way to think about ethics. It's keeping, the things that we do in check. Could also absolutely undermine the credibility of the court, right? The minute you start doing strange things, even in confidential type hearings, word gets out, and the credibility of your court can be challenged. All right. Any others? Lack of trust. Absolutely. And I think, that's one of the hard things. I think that's one of the hardest things, just working in general in Healing to Wellness, family treatment court, but I think particularly with youth is gaining that trust. And a lot of the families we work with have trust issues. If a lot of people, for whatever reason, they feel they've been let down, they've endured a lot of trauma. And so it's so important that we have ethical rules. Not only that we have them, but we help people understand them and to develop that trust. Let's go on to the next slide. All right. So I just wanted to quickly recap just the structure of a Healing to Wellness court. Some of the basics. We won't go through all the things we usually talk about when we're talking about Healing to Wellness. But just in case we have any new people here who are working on developing their Healing to Wellness courts. And so it's very different than regular court hearings. It's non-adversarial. You're working together using a team approach, team-oriented. Sometimes this is hard for judges and attorneys. This is not something we're taught in school. Anna noted, went to law school, and then I worked as a prosecutor for I think about 4 years, and then I went back to school and worked on my master's in public policy. And the thing that stuck out me the most in working in my master's was the teamwork, because I was not used to that, right? As a prosecutor, you have your prosecutor buddies, but you just swap war stories. You don't really, or ask for advice. You don't really do teamwork. And so that was a new thing for me. And so it can be very difficult. And it also forces us to up against some of our ethical rules, because for attorneys, our ethical rules, and for judges too, are really just focused. And most, if you think about, counselors, you're focused on that individual, and it doesn't necessarily encompass group work. So we work together as a team, and that promotes transparency and communication, right? We're focused on the participant. So we share information. This is why we have to know the confidentiality rules, so we know how we can deal with them in the proper way. And we also work through phases, right? You're slowly taking the training wheels off of your participants. You surround them with a lot of structure and reporting and things of that nature. But as they develop the recovery tools, those things are removed as you work through the phases in your wellness court. So those are the basics. We have tons of information for you if you need more information about how to develop a wellness core and the key components and the strategies for doing juvenile healing to wellness. So don't be shy to ask for those materials. All right, let's go on to the next slide. So I thought this would be a good time to talk a little bit about the fact that we have different rules for different roles. So now we have these team members. We're like, okay, we're going to all work together. It doesn't always go smoothly. And I think sometimes we chalk this up to, well, I don't like so-and-so because of XYZ. Now, there can always be personal conflict, but a lot of times it's because we play different roles. And our roles require us to perform certain duties, and sometimes it can create conflict. So the first one is for attorneys who are doing juvenile defense, right? And this is actually also tends to be a basic ethical rule for attorneys: is counsel must provide competent, diligent, and zealous advocacy to protect the client's procedural and substantive rights. No mention of wellness or addiction or anything of that nature, right? You're just focused on the legal system, and you're supposed to work really hard just to make sure all their rights are protected. And so when suddenly you're asking an attorney to share information about a youth, about whether or not they've tested positive in a drug test, or there's concerns about use, and you're trying to get the attorney to focus on promoting the youth or the adults wellness and living in recovery, it's a challenge, right? Because they're required to focus on these type of issues, and focus on no, you can't sanction that person because you didn't have a hearing, right? That's their job. That's what they need to do, and it's not because they want to just simply disagree with you. It's because they're doing their job. I pulled this next one from the New York Society for Clinical Social Work Code of Ethics. So I'm in New York, and our treatment people are licensed in New York to provide addiction services, also our mental health people. So this is for a clinical social worker. So the responsibility is to the individual, patient, the family, or group, okay, whoever they have the professional relationship with. And they have to respect the dignity, protect the welfare, and maximize the self-determination of the patients, right, whom they treat. So they're focusing on the patient, and there's no notion of, oh, so we're going to sit around a table and we're going to discuss the patient as a team, and these aren't just clinical social workers, this is the judge and the attorney, and can I share this information with them? And a lot of the studies that I've looked at, and some of the research I've done historically, there has been a clash between counselors and child welfare workers, because the treatment counselors are very focused on parent, right, in a family treatment court, but it could happen again in juvenile as well. They're focused on the parent, and child welfare tends to be focused on the child, putting them in a safe environment. And so treatment workers don't necessarily want to disclose, yes, the person used, because the fear that, oh, then the child will get removed, or perhaps the youth will be placed in the home, and that'll do more harm in the work that they're doing as a counselor. And so it's this very can create a tension, and makes it difficult to work together. All right, so let's go on to the next slide, and then we're gonna see if we can get you to chat a little bit more. Here's a couple other different ethical rules. So one's this is the for judges. This is the model code of judicial conduct, and a lot of even tribes sometimes use some of this language as well. A judge shall perform the duties of the judicial office impartially, competently, and diligently. Nothing about, can I sit down, get off the bench and sit down and talk with people. And a lot of judges, I don't hear this as much as I used to, but I used to hear a lot from judges that they felt uncomfortable attending the staffings because information was being shared outside of a hearing. It's not on the record. The participants not there, and they felt it was violating their ethical duties. That they were ex parte communications, meaning outside of the parties. Maybe the defense attorney was there, maybe the defense attorney wasn't there. It kind of depends on the structure of your staffing and your team. So this was very much a concern. The model rules, they do have an exception. So I always encourage judges, if you don't have that in your tribal judicial ethics, to work on enacting that, is for therapeutic courts, that you can share information that's not ex parte. But again, that's the rules don't necessarily envision that, and it can make it difficult and for team members. And then, of course, if you have, especially in juvenile court, if you have a juvenile wellness court, if you have education team members, they're bound by FERPA. And so we'll talk about consent, right? Getting consent to share information to the team members. And so there's all these different roles that we have where can create some conflict, right? And we're used to focusing on our roles, and now all of a sudden we have to, not only do we have to work together as a team, which can be hard just as a general rule because we're not used to doing that, but we also have to abide by my ethics, and I have to be cognizant of other people's ethics. And I think, I always tell judges, this places a burden on you to make sure that your team members train each other, and so we can understand the challenges that we're facing. So before we go on to the next slide, I'm going to ask you to just type in the chat a little bit. Any experiences that you've had with some of these team members or other team members, and you don't need to be specific. You can give a hypothetical if you want. Or challenges that you find because of ethics and because of these different ethical rules. So just type in the chat any challenges you've had because of the different ethical rules with your team members.
Well, we wait for those to share in the chat. I know in my experience in working with different communities that we work with at the Tribal Youth Resource Center, I know a lot of the time it is about the information sharing, and for some communities who maybe they don't have a full-time judge, or they have somebody that comes in and out of the community, and I know we're going to probably talk a little bit about this later, but more difficult to overcome some of those relationship building aspects that contribute to the capability to share information. And so when you have somebody that isn't completely tied into the community and maybe not necessarily tied fully into the team, but they are supporting the work because they serve as a judge or serve in some capacity in the juvenile justice system, we've seen more difficulty there in sharing of information, or maybe not fully understanding the ways in which the team wants to be able to collaborate. So that's been something that has come up, I know, in conversation.
Absolutely. The sharing of information it's hard to get over that hurdle, and Suzanne has also put that in the chat. And one of the best examples that I heard back when I was working with Mark, who now works at NADCP, Penishevitz, and he's a counselor. And again, so he has his ethical obligations about what he can or cannot reveal, that a client has said to him, but then he's in the staffing. And he shared that one way, let's say there's a concern that perhaps the participant is using, and Mark knows because he's revealed it in a session, but Mark's not feeling comfortable with sharing. Yeah, Joe here has, said, disclosed he used last night, right? So Mark says he feels comfortable saying to the team, I think now would be a really good time to drug test Joe, and just leaves it there. He hasn't disclosed anything. He's just either suggesting it, maybe the team hasn't gotten there yet, and he, that would be typically normal, or, agreeing if somebody else has. So there, I understand people are often, attorneys, counselors, very concerned. I always tell our counselors and our participants, we don't need details about what you're talking about in mental health, especially in your mental health sessions, if that's what you're doing, but also in your addiction sessions. We're not looking for he's struggling, or he or she is struggling with this youth, has a history of sexual abuse or things like that. Those are not the things we're looking for in your staffing. You're looking for, is the participant engaged? And could you just tell me in general terms how you define engaging, right? If hopefully engaging to a counselor is not just sitting in group and nodding your head, right? But you're actually engaged. The words we look for, are they sharing? So trying to encourage your team to look for ways to share information without sharing confidential details. Okay, so I'm going back into the chat here. Let's see. Okay, so the wellness judge also hearing juvenile hearings, which can include dependency and neglect cases. So this is an interesting one. So perhaps the concern that the judge knows too much about the family or the participant, and can the judge be neutral? And this comes up a lot. You see in state courts when an adult participant is terminated and goes back to criminal court, and sometimes it's the same judge. And this happens in tribal court frequently because you only have one judge. And can they be sentenced now? And the rule generally, it's not a rule written in stone, but generally we tell participants, and hopefully we respect this, we don't punish you for trying healing to wellness, right? Maybe sentenced afterwards, but you don't get punished for failing out of healing to wellness court. So I think that's just something that the judge needs to ask themselves, like you would on any case, especially in our communities, because I get people all the time who, like, they're not my friends, but we're a small community. I know about them. And I get this a lot. Frequently, I'll have a participant who will have another case, and it's just a civil case, and a lot of times it's a probate case. So they're arguing about who owns the property, and I do a check with myself. Is there a chance in this case, any allegations of whether a person's abusing substances? If for whatever reason is this going to come up, and do I feel that I can handle this case? And sometimes you're the only judge, and sometimes you just have to do it, and just do your best to document everything on the record for why you're making certain decisions, so it's clear that you're not being impartial. That's the most important thing. But it can happen. But as long as the judges understand what they can take into account when they're making dependency and neglect decisions, what they're allowed to consider, and they're not holding against a participant their what's happening in your wellness court. And again, document everything. If you're removing a child, it needs to be because the child's life is their safety issues, not because you are unhappy with the performance in wellness court. Here's an interesting one. Concern was raised over sending any basic information out to team members by a tribal email. This has actually come up with us as well. We used to do that. And then we didn't have any major snafu, but we also know our counselors, they could never respond back about a participant, right? Because of their rules. They said, well, we can fax you, or you can fax us. In the court, we don't even have a fax, because we're like, who uses fax machines anymore? And the former judge got rid of our fax machine. And so, and that's, then the basic rule is, if you're sharing participant information, you should have some security, whether it's, and I'm not an IT person, but you should have some levels of security. So what we've done is we no longer share that over email. So our teams come in, this is back when we were in person, and our case manager who does our family treatment court, and our coordinator who does our adult treatment, she would just send around hard copies of her notes, and we take the first 10 minutes and people would read them. And then at the end, when we were all over said and done, she would collect them back. So I encourage you to think of workarounds. So we don't, yes, we no longer share participant information over email just to protect their identity. Sometimes my staff will email me, so that's our case manager and our coordinator, and we just use initials to make sure we're not disclosing any identity. Our Healing to Wellness court right now is small enough that we can just use initials, and I will remember who they are. Okay, so let's go on to the next slide. All right. And so this is something, and Jacob, please feel free to jump in, because this was a good point in discussions that he and Anna and I had pointed out, is that we, a lot of our team members, we have multi-layered ethical obligations at times. For us as attorneys, often we can belong to a couple different bars, whether it's a state bar, tribal bar, federal bar. And so we have to consider that. Some of our counselors may as well, depending on, where they're required to be licensed. Did you want to say anything more about that, Jacob?
No, but I did have some questions regarding your experience as a judge, and then having individuals work within your court and their obligations. There are different ethical obligations on multiple layers. Like, what's your recommendation for those people who may not have that federal, state, or tribal ethical obligation, and maybe there isn't an ethical code besides the HR one, or maybe a judge who isn't licensed, or advocates? I know that's a big issue now, is what's the strength of an advocate in terms of defense counsel in tribal court? What's your recommendations as far as them holding themselves accountable, even though there's no overarching set of rules?
Mm-hmm. That's such a good question, and I do see this with there are some amazing lay judges and lay attorneys out there, but there are also some who struggle. And maybe, who are good at some things, but struggle with the ethics of it. Or I should say, understanding the ethical obligations, because it's not always apparent. I think, ex parte communications, I think, not talking to the parties outside the other party. So just having a conversation with one party is not just, it does, it comes easy. I think as attorneys, we're just like, oh, no, I can't do that, because it gets drilled in your head for 3 years. And then once you start practicing, and it's not second nature. And I think especially as Indigenous people, we like to talk things out, and well, maybe if I just talk to this person, I can, then I'll go talk, but you're not a mediator, right? And so I think the critical is, one, to have something. If you have lay advocates or lay judges in your community, it's important to have ethical rules just for them, and to require training, and not just a one and done, but a yearly, because I think it's something that is so critical, and I think sometimes, unintentionally, they can create problems, harm for their parties without knowing it. Thinking they're doing the best that they can. And so,
Judge Garrow, just to follow up. So on the other side of the coin, it seems like the Juvenile Healing and Wellness Court almost asks the individuals with those ethical obligations, specifically the defense attorneys, in terms of sharing information, to kind of overlook those particular obligations, and having individuals who may not have experience within tribal courts and expressing to them what the expectations are. And a healing and wellness court seems like it could be kind of problematic in terms of the overall operations of the court. So when it gets to that point, is your recommendation just training those individuals as well? Because like you stated earlier, it seems kind of hard to, you know, you've got law school and then your license obligations. It seems hard to kind of get those habits out of, you know, an attorney's mindset.
Yes, and I 100% agree. It's incredibly hard for defense attorneys, you know, and especially hard. You know, you may have defense attorneys kind of in and out, right? Depending on your structure, you might not have one public defender who works in your juvenile healing to wellness court, and it can. So this could be your team's downfall because there's so much conflict, right? And then it becomes personal, right? And so it can be your downfall. So I think it's so important, and I think a lot of it is really, you know, place it on the judge is, okay, we're all going to learn what the defense attorney's ethical rules are, and we're all going to be trained about how we can help his, you know, his or her, the defense attorneys, the lay advocates, how we can help them stay within their ethical rules, but we can still communicate. And it's not an easy task. But I think the judge has to take ownership, because if the judge doesn't lead the team in getting it done, it's not going to happen. And I would encourage those of you who are, you know, have other roles, whether you're a coordinator, you know, if you or someone else on this team, you know, and you see this issue, is, you know, to work with your coordinators and your judges to say, will you lead us through this, and help us understand, you know, have the defense attorneys in group, in your team, explain their rules and say, okay, now how are we going to work within these rules? Because it can be done. And yes, there's some, you know, are you going to share everything with us? No. Are you going to advocate all the time that there should never be a sanction? Yes. And that's okay, because that's your job. And can you be okay with the fact that, you know, Madam Public Defender, that you're not always going to get your way? And that's good. And with the lay advocate too, understanding, you know, what their obligations are, and everyone on the team understanding each other, right? So the lay advocate does have some ethical rules, and this is what we're expecting you to abide by, but yet work together. And it's a hard place to navigate, especially if you have a team that has had some conflict. So my other encouragement is, don't give up, right? And keep your eye on the ball. Like, the reason you're there arguing amongst each other about these rules is because of the youth, right? You're trying to help these juveniles get out of the court system so they don't end up in your adult system, and you're not just like, oh my gosh, now I have this kid for 50 years. So you need to, especially as attorneys, we need to put aside our I'm always right. And
what about getting rid of defense attorneys altogether? That was a bad prosecutor joke. I'm sorry.
I don't really have a problem with that, but I've heard others have a problem with that. That generally that's not a good idea. But ironically, long story short, we don't actually have attorneys in our healing to wellness court, because we get our referrals from the state. They're already on probation. They have their attorneys, just don't appear, and they give consent, and, you know, and so we never have those conflicts.
I was actually just about to bring that up. I think one slide before was, when we look at this transition from, you know, the traditional, maybe like Western model of court, and we think about wellness courts and the structure of some moving into this, you know, completely restorative and local, culturally planned and developed and implemented process that may not look like court at all. And so you don't have all these, maybe you don't have each one of these players. Maybe you have, you know, there is an advocate there of some kind, you know, working with somebody in an official capacity, but they may not be housing the work in the court. So there's not necessarily a judge involved even weekly. Maybe they're checking in intermittently because this youth is, you know, their case is in place on hold, they're moved into the wellness court, and now really it is just, you know, a couple of advocates and treatment provider working together for that youth. So, but even then, you're still going to have some of these standards and principles for whoever it is that's providing services coming into play, because there's always going to be some sharing of information. So whatever environment you're in, there's probably some, you know, we're going to talk about it, but local values there, at minimum, and then you move into these higher levels or tiers of, here's this other layer of principles that you're supposed to abide by for this particular field or discipline.
Absolutely. And, and I was just thinking too, trying to think of it, especially from a youth perspective, like when you're thinking about, do we want some sort of defense attorney or advocate there, and when we know what that comes with, sort of the ethical issues that we have to navigate, but by having someone on your team that is representing the youth, the juvenile, they know that someone is there advocating for them, and that can be a good thing, especially if they've developed a relationship. I know a lot of defense attorneys who work in juvenile justice, and they work hard at developing relationships with their clients, and just to know that, think about from the youth perspective, that they know that they have someone there. But it's your team, you get to design it, and you have the sovereignty to decide what you want your team to look like, and the best fit for your court, for your culture, and your community. So but don't be scared of the ethical issues, because you can work through, if you have conflict, you can work through that. Let's go to the next slide. So we'll stop talking maybe as much about attorneys, but team members who often don't have licenses. Some of them, obviously, advocates. If you have advocates who lay advocates, perhaps who aren't required, but a lot of times, especially on our juvenile teams, we have mentors, we have volunteers, we have. And they might not be on the team, but perhaps we use them a lot. We have a lot of youth programming out there for pro-social activities, recreational activities, and we get reports back from them. Maybe they come to the team, maybe they don't. We also have, people who are not just, but the standards they abide by are whatever, HR tribal codes of conduct you have for your employees, because they're an employee. So, for example, my healing to wellness coordinator and my case manager, they are tribal employees, right? They're not licensed, they're not clinical social workers, and so they're very well trained in healing to wellness, so they know what's expected of them, and they have job duties, so they know what's expected of them. But many of their other conduct would just be governed by our HR handbook, employee handbook, that says you have to be professional, you have to be respectful, things of that nature. Don't steal, don't misuse tribal property, and so that's something to think about as well. Do you have those in place? So you have something. Is it clear if it's if you have someone dedicated as a job to your juvenile team? Are you specific in their job duties about what's expected of them? And then the hard one sometimes can be elders, and or other people from the community members. And I think it's important that we do background checks. That's standard for tribal employees. But if you're going to have people on your team from the community, first you should have a policy about that, and about how those people are chosen. We actually, a while ago, had a community member write us a letter and said, "Hey, can I join your healing to wellness team?" And we were like, "You wanna what?" Because we don't have any community members. And my response was, "Well, I'm not opposed to considering it, but we would have to have a policy in place, and then do sort of a general happening and anybody interested." So we thanked the person profusely for being interested, but we didn't have that infrastructure yet. And so I would encourage you to have those any sort of job duty descriptions, your HR policies, and then your background checks, and make sure your participants know that everybody here has had a background check. We all abide by our ethical duties about confidentiality, and things of that nature. I looked at I think handbook for mentors in a juvenile court working with youth, and their obligation and ethical duty was to work to benefit mentees. And I said, well, that's good, but that also, like, what does that mean? Um, and you can have a lot of competing issues, especially happens with adults, but I think it also happens with youth. When do you disclose if you're worried about them harming themselves, or you're worried about them using and their parents don't know? And it's also hard because, and we'll talk if we get to this today, we might not. But you have to also develop a relationship with the family as well, and sometimes that there can be conflict. And so how do you do about that? And so it can be very challenging to be a mentor for a youth. And it's very easy, I think, to step over an ethical line, thinking you're doing the right thing. I have watched Healing to Wellness staff members in other places not be honest with their team because they were trying to protect the participants, right? And then, of course, then the team finds out, and then usually the staff member gets fired, and so you have to remember where your ethical rules are. Sometimes you have to disclose to protect the, if the youth is going to do harm. All right. Anybody, Anna, do you have anything you want to talk about this? And type in the chat if you have questions or concerns or examples of this when you're dealing with team members who might not have a license.
Yeah, so we did have a question. So somebody had asked about examples of rules or policies regarding the team. And I responded that our center and TLPI has several examples of individual team roles and responsibilities. But when we share those, we always talk about, what are those local, like we just walked through, you may have oaths of office, you may have your own local HR roles. So other things that might you need to take into consideration when you're looking at other communities, examples of their roles and responsibilities. But we definitely have those to share. For us working with Juvenile Healing to Wellness course, I think there are a large number that do have different volunteers and other mentors that come in. And I really like what you shared about the background check. I know OJJDP, for all of those that are federally funded that are on today, there is a requirement, I believe, in the special conditions of the grant, that there be some kind of background check policy in place. And usually what we recommend if they're a newly developing court is to work with their already youth serving programs and see if there's an existing policy in place. And if not, we have some samples of background check forms and other things, but a lot goes into that. So some probably one-on-one recommendations as they're looking at developing their background check policy. But that's something we can help provide some guidance or suggestions as they look at developing that. But I think it's really important. We know that youth who are in the Juvenile Healing to Wellness court, one of the things we want to reduce is stigma. And so it is trying to have them be a part of all of the youth programs that are going on in the community already. And so if they're not already participating regularly, encouraging them to be a part of those other activities, those recreational or skills building or just other community cultural things that are going on that are supporting youth. And so hopefully the team is able to build relationships with whoever's leading those programs and activities and get their input, like how is this youth doing when they're there? Are they participating? We talked about their engagement. And so sharing of information there, and probably important as part of the policies in your court to look at, how are we reaching out to this particular program? Do we have some kind of MOU or something in place so that we can share information? What kinds of information is going to be shared? When do we share it? So all of those as part of your regular communications plan and protecting information of the youth participants. So I know a lot goes into the juvenile wellness court when you're thinking about all the different aspects of who are we working with to support this youth, but it's really important to think about all of the different partners that might be coming into play.
Awesome. Jacob, did you want to add anything?
In terms of background checks, I do have a question. Whether or not you've seen, like, say, the cultural component of the juvenile healing wellness court, you have a youth who may go and help one of the local medicine fraternities. In terms of getting background checks on those individuals, one way to forego that, to have an adult or guardian with that youth to participate in those sorts of things.
That's an excellent question, right? Because we might be, referring, encouraging you to go to a cultural activity where, it's run by elders or someone in the community, that doesn't work directly with the team, so there's no requirement for a background check. And I think that's an excellent requirement, is to take an adult with them. Doesn't have to be a parent. It could be someone else the team approves of. Maybe it's an aunt or grandmother, grandfather, or someone else in their family, or an approved adult friend, or be someone on the team. It's appropriate for them to go. But I think that's an excellent requirement, is sending an adult, requiring an adult to attend with them, and also can help you with which we'll talk about. We talk about family involvement. One of the hugest hurdles is transportation, especially for our youth. And so then, you've crossed off that issue, is because now you require an adult, and the adult can take the youth, and they make sure that they have a way to get there, no excuse. But that's excellent. All right, let's go to the next slide. We're gonna try to get some more chat discussion going on here. So, and this great discussion that Jacob brought up is that a lot of our community values determine how we interact with the youth. And so here's some questions that I encourage you to type in the chat. How do we find these values? And do you have formal, written standards of codes of conduct for tribal staff? And are they involving youth? And so, and who's required to comply? But also then, if someone, what's the process for a challenge, right? If you've, heard that one of your, a staff person was inappropriate and stepped over the ethical line, do you know the process? Is there a process? So, a lot of things to think about. So I invite you to type in the chat, especially the first question. So your community values, our societies mostly were oral, and our values and are found in our customs and traditions. So how do you find your community values about working with youth? How do you find those? Type it in the chat. And Jacob, feel free to chime in while we're waiting for people to type in the chat.
Well, I think it starts with families, and then obviously the relationships between families and the web that's connected throughout the community. And then over time, there appears to be a development of community values that different families share with one another. And I think just having that foundation can help build trust, when you're going through a healing and wellness process, because even without, formal ethical resolutions or policies and procedures, there still tends to be an acknowledgement of who's who and who is trustworthy, based on just your knowledge of individuals within the community and their family's history.
I love that. Ask our families, because our families also may have something specific, like values that that is important to that family. And so I think that's so critical that they're in our families. Check with our families, ask them. And it's a great way to engage a family. Not seeing anyone chatting. So one thing I would encourage, and so I've been fortunate, I've been working on a project for TLPI, and they've been very patient because it's taken me forever, is and this grew out of a couple of leadership sessions I did at our Healing to Wellness enhancement trainings pre-pandemic, about traditional values and leadership, helping us, especially as tribal judges. I think when we're young judges or maybe young attorneys thinking about becoming a judge, or just young people in general thinking about becoming a judge, you think, well, being a judge is just about making decisions in cases, and that's not really true. You're very much a leader, especially in the healing wellness context, because now you have a whole team of people you're trying to get to work together, and keep your court funded, so you can help participants. And the place that I turn to looking for leadership skills in our traditional stories, have had just a lot of fun going some of our traditional stories and looking for different leadership skills. And in stories, sometimes you might not think that that's very obvious. You're like, oh, that's just a funny story. But if you stop and think about it, that story is actually telling you something. And so that's a great way to determine also how to interact with our youth and how to take care of them. Because I've come across quite a few of our stories that talk about youth and how we should care for them and what we should do. And so yeah, we have perfect. We have in the chat, we're taught community values by our families, grandparents, parents, siblings, and teachers. We start young, so important. We answer the questions our little ones give us. And yes, as parents versus grandparents, our values can change, I think, as we grow. And that's also important, I think, remember, thinking about our youth, is that we help them learn these values, right? Maybe they never had a chance to learn these values and maybe they've never been treated the way they should be treated, which is why they're now acting out and they're in your juvenile healing to wellness court, because they haven't had people care for them properly. And one of the things that we do with adults in our healing to wellness and our family treatment court is to remind our adults that they're important and they have value, and that we need them to contribute to our community. And so that's why we're here cheering them on. So that's an important thing to teach our youth. Let's see, also here's a good one. Pose the question to at tribal council meetings, or and that have a community discussion. So let me see, how are we doing on time?
We have about 20 minutes if we leave room for questions at the end. About half an hour.
Okay, so I would encourage you to be familiar with standards, and learn them. We just have a note in the chat about being new in the community, and that can also be a challenge. It takes a lot of patience to and don't give up. Find the appropriate people to ask, whether it's certain people you work with, whether you have a tribal historian or their tribal elders, or you go to your tribal museum or tribal library. If you're brand new to the community, it's some of the research I've been doing for my project. I've come across some great examples of people who are transplants, right? Working in a community that's not their own, and it took them a while, but they built great relationships because they took the time to learn the community. And so I would encourage you to do that, and encourage you to know all your formal and informal rules that regulate our ethics. On to the next slide. We'll talk a tiny bit about confidentiality. Let me get to the next slide. Or is our PowerPoint being difficult? Well, while we're doing that, I'm just going to throw a question out and you can put it in the chat. Why, oh, there we are. Why do we have confidentiality rules? So we're going to switch, right? And hopefully, you know, if you're familiar, if you already have your juvenile healing to wellness core up and running, you know, and especially it can vary by state, but generally a lot of juvenile matters are confidential, they're closed. Why do we have confidentiality rules? In healing to wellness. We'll keep it specific. See, now if we were in person, we would give you a reward. We would have candy and give you a reward, but creates trust. Yeah.
I know. I wish we were throwing candy bars to each other.
I know. I had this memory of doing that in this huge room. I think probably at some NADCP late in the afternoon and rewarding people who showed up with chocolate.
I think you shared Jacob said create trust. I see we've got more people responding now.
Protect the youth individual. Absolutely. So it creates trust, right? Okay. I'm sure you all have the friend that you know not to tell certain things to because it's just, you know, in ear, out the mouth. And you still love that friend, but you just know, okay, that's not the friend you're going to share your inner secrets with. So it creates trust, right? You want the youth to know that the things they share are going to be stayed, but you also want them to know what the boundaries of that are and when they're shared. It also protects the youth and the individual. And the thought behind when they developed confidentiality rules with regards to getting treatment for substance use disorder, this is back in the day when they still called it addiction, is that we want to encourage people, right? There's a lot of stigma with going to receive treatment, and people often don't want their employers to know, they don't want their family to know, they know they need help, but they don't want, you know, they don't want their neighbors to know, they don't want their nosy aunt to know. So we have these rules that require us as service providers to keep information confidential, but you can't work in a team unless you can share information. So what we do is, in order to work with these confidentiality requirements, is we have our participants give consent. And we could spend a couple of hours about obtaining consent and all the rules and ins and outs. But the basic rule is you have your minors give consent. The minors, even though they're minors, they have to give consent. And as a practice, also get the parent to give consent, and have the minor as part of your consent that sometimes you're going to share information back to the parent because you have to. And then also be clear, the minors, you know, what they're doing. You know, and some people don't want to give consent, but it's a requirement, right? If you want to be in healing to wellness, and generally there's you know, there's a carrot, you know, if you do healing to wellness, then, you know, maybe you know, you won't be punished for the conduct that you were engaging in. Simply you're just trying to help the youth realize they need a healthier lifestyle and to deal with their substance use disorder. But you have to explain to the youth what's going on. And so I'll just toss this question out to you, because a lot of you probably have some experience in this. How do you get a youth, a minor, someone who's under the age of 18? Of course, you have to do this with adults too. And sometimes our adults are, because of their substance use, are stuck in their teenage years. But how do you get a teenager? How do you convince them to give you consent to share information? And it should be, you should have your forms. They should be super clear in naming the people that you're going to share information with, and you're not going to share any information with anybody else that's not on this list. But how do you get a teenager to say yes to that? Any suggestions? Type it in the chat. I have trouble getting my niece and nephews, to decide, if they want pizza or tacos. I'm not sure what they do if I came at them with, here's a consent form. Letting them know the process and how it benefits them. Perfect. Tacos. Okay.
Promise the future talk.
Next time when we're in person, Jacob. Take your time and build your trust. So important. It's not going to happen first session, right? Meet them where they at. Do it over pizza. Perfect. Always bring food. Be honest, right? That's so important, right? You're building trust, that you're working with a team, and these are the rules in order to work as a team and make sure they get the best services, the best care ever. You have to share, build a relationship, gain trust, be empathetic, right? And remind them you're here to work with them, right? Absolutely. You're not here to reprimand them. Absolutely. I love, and I'm not going to say the best way that my coordinator does with our participants, but Shafin reminds them, I'm not here to judge you. I'm not here to yell at you. Oh, okay, maybe every once in a while she might scold, but we're here to help, and it's kind of up to you. But we're not here to judge, right? And that's so important too, that we look at the individual and not judge them. So awesome. And you guys know your youth, and so you work with them the way that's appropriate in your culture, and you'll have a lot more success if you can take that time, explain it to them, build that trust. No, it's probably not going to happen the first time around. That you explain to them healing to wellness, but be willing to invest that time with them. It'll pay off down the road. Be honest about their rights, right? Let them know what their rights are, and help them feel empowered, right? These are your rights. That's why I'm explaining this to you. I'm not just going to share this information willy-nilly, because whatever you share with me is important, and you have to agree to give it up. So they know their options, and also know how it can help them. Right. And give them concrete examples about the kind of information you'll share and why you share it. Okay. That you're not and you're not sitting around gossiping. Best thing, I stole this from somebody else, and I can't remember it now because I'm getting older who said it, but it was in a presentation. And they were talking about like your team when you're doing your staffing, how do you make sure you're not just gossiping, and the rule was, if you're just going around the circle and constantly talking about the same thing over and over, then you're just gossiping. But if you're coming up with a new strategy, then you're actually doing your team staffing. And you can explain that to youth, that we're not just sitting around talking about you. We're actually discussing all the great things you've done, and we want to make sure we recognize them. And then if we're not doing a good job, we want to reassess how we can help you better. So you give them all sorts of those kinds of examples. Also type in the chat, are there specific issues that you have with confidentiality? We want to make sure that if you have questions or the common question when I've done this for adult healing to wellness courts, talking about confidentiality, this came up with state court drug courts, was accidentally disclosing in open court that one of your participants was pregnant. Don't do that. Okay. Just that's information the participant should share. And the judge is like, congratulations, or the attorney is like, no, don't do that. Oh, okay. Lots of misunderstandings around HIPAA. Okay. About when you can share information. And it can vary. I'm sure at some point, maybe Anna and Jacob will be having a session specifically about confidentiality, and because it can differ between youth and family treatment and criminal and so in your back pocket, easy answer is if you have a court order, but it can still be different when you're in civil court. So
Judge Garrow,
yes.
one of the questions
go ahead.
I run into with grantees is when the youth doesn't want their guardian or parent to sign off on confidentiality. You made it sound like the youth themselves can sign the agreement alone. Is that something that you've had to deal with? And do you think that, legally, that would be
Sufficient.
appropriate? Yeah.
Is a question. I think it's standard practice. I think it can also depend on your jurisdiction. I would always have the youth and the guardian sign off on it just as a best practice, and explain to the youth why, and also explain to the youth, in certain circumstances you might be sharing information with the parent, so they're listed on the list of who you can share information with. So I would have them both sign, because there are times that the parent or the guardian is going to disclose information. Let's say, Jacob, you're the attorney. There are times, that the parent or guardian is going to disclose information to you, and you're going to be in a conundrum. Can I share that with the team? But if you have the consent form that they've signed, then you're covered.
I think that's important. And I know when we were talking about this particular, the parent or guardian role, you need to look there locally at what are the rules, what are the rights of parents in that particular jurisdiction, because even we were talking about the difference between the sharing of information among the team, but in some communities or in some states, like if you happen to be in a PL 280 state and you're in California, we were talking about how, youth are able to access some treatment services without a parent being a part of that process, so they can request and consent and access certain things in the community and not necessarily need a parent or guardian participating in that, which, that's separate from the team and sharing of information. But just knowing there locally, what are the expectations or responsibilities of parents, and giving that to the families up front too, like, we expect that you're a part of this, or, we respect youth's individual right to participate in this process, and we allow them to consent to the sharing of information, but making it very clear up front, whatever those expectations or rights are, before they start the process and not after.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I don't know if this is what Suzanne was getting to in the chat, but with HIPAA, my experience has been sometimes service providers, waive HIPAA and, oh no, sorry, I can't share anything with you. And again, so that misunderstanding, and it's sometimes can be a slow task, that training people and getting them to understand, no, we have consent and you can share that information. And so it's critically important to, as a team, to go to trainings, and on confidentiality. And actually, I think the last one I went to where I wasn't doing it, I went because I was going to be doing one. And it was this huge room, and it was packed. And it was Saturday, like last session of the NADCP, and it was packed. And that crowd was hostile to those presenters. They were so hostile. They just kept like heckling them and asking them all these questions. That made me very scared, actually. This was many years ago. And so it's tough. It is, confidentiality. It's tough, but that's the way that I teach, is like, we always say that it's tough, but it can be very simple, because the basic rule is, if you consent and if you fill out your consent form very specifically, and you list all your team members and you stick to that and you don't break that rule, then you're fine. But people get scared. And sometimes they heckle you when you try to teach them about it. But I would encourage you, as your team members, to make sure that you're trained on confidentiality, all your team, right? And listen to your team members' concerns, and they will say better safe than sorry, as Suzanne wrote in the chat, and they won't discuss. Because then there's a flip side. Judge Jackson, Charlene Jackson, who I've done many ethics trainings with at NADCP, she will cite to a case where I think an attorney was disciplined for not sharing information, or it might have been a counselor, I can't remember now, for not sharing information when they had consent and should have. So there's the flip side. If you have consent and you refuse to share that information, you're not fulfilling your role, your duty to the client, because the client signed that consent form and said, yes, you can share. And so you should be doing your due diligence to do your job to share the appropriate information. And just, again, make sure that, we're not down in the details. You know, I think sometimes as judges or attorneys, we may think, oh, I need to know the specifics of that youth's trauma. We don't. And actually, it's just going to make us more traumatized. And maybe accidentally sometimes make us treat that youth a little differently. And even though we may be trying to be more compassionate, we just need to know. We can certainly ask our team members to let us know if the youth, this is a scary time of year, because a traumatic event happened. But we don't need to go into the details. Unless our participants want us to know. Sometimes they'll share. Sometimes they share in court. Sometimes, I'll ask the participant, how are you doing? And sometimes they'll just open up and then we go with it. But if they don't, I do not press them, because but I'll tell them, this is something you might want to talk to your counselor about. If you're having a hard time at this time of year, or having a hard time in school, you're angry at your parents, this is something you might want to think about talking to your parents. I have a family treatment court who has a participant who's having a lot of problems with one of her kids, I think she's in middle school. And so we do a lot of the flip side, talking about that child and techniques, she's trying to do with that child. And sometimes she opens up and sometimes she does not want to talk about it. And that's okay. So it's important to share information, but only need to know, right? Okay, so let's go. We got 2 minutes, maybe a minute and a half.
I had one scenario. I will not name community names, but for some tribal communities where you have maybe someone in a higher power of authority or leadership, and because of family members involved in court wanting to know information, or kind of too much overlap of wanting to share information or see how something's going. I've seen that come up before. I know that's really difficult to navigate for, if you're just a prosecutor or somebody working in the court and feeling like a duty to be responsive to a tribal leader, but then at the same time maintaining confidentiality and not sharing information unnecessarily.
Absolutely. I've had new just court staff like come into our court, new court clerks, and our training is, if someone calls about healing to wellness, I cannot confirm or deny whether or not that person is in healing to wellness. Would you like to talk to our coordinator? She'll tell you the same thing, but you're welcome to talk to our coordinator. And just, to not, even though you might get to know these people because they come in and out of the court for drug tests, but it's according to them, when you see them out in the community, whether or not you say hello, because you don't want that person's mom to be like, how do you know the court clerk? So. All right. So I don't know that we're really going to have time. The rest of the slides are about family involvement, which we could spend. So we might want to save those for part 2.
I think that sounds great. And I think for those who are on today, would love to have you in the chat, maybe share some of the things you want to talk about in session 2, because that does help guide some of the conversation or topics that we might delve into. Specifically, some of these more complicated scenarios that come up, we'll put Judge Garrow up there and let her give us some suggested responses to different scenarios, because we know those things come up. And I think, the point of this session was to start some conversations on the topic, because we know that issues come up with teams, that there is team conflict over information sharing, that different, we're all trying to work in the best interest of youth. We all have these duties that we feel like we're trying to adhere to, and responsibilities, and how do we work together best, and also just adhering to our values, like the values of our communities, and and really trying to uplift youth and their families while we're working with them. So holding ourselves to the highest standards that we can, and promoting that environment of trust and respect and dignity. So I think it's good to keep the conversation going and hear from you all on what you're interested in.
If you have any questions, feel free to type them in the chat. I know it sounds like Jacob, you've had hard times getting medical health records from IHS. I've never had to do that. I imagine that can be difficult.
So you can keep typing your questions in the chat, and then propose topics for our session 2. Please put those in the chat. We'd love to know what you all are interested in talking about. While we're waiting, I did want to share, we posted the link to wellnesscourts.org, but you can also go to our website, tribalyouth.org, anytime. You can submit a training and technical assistance request. So we provide training and technical assistance to all CTAS Purpose Area 8 and 9 grantees, specifically as our what we're funded to support. But we also can work with any community that's supporting tribal youth. So if you're not funded by a grant right now and you're on the session today, we would love to get to know you better if you're interested in developing a wellness core or developing programs to support your youth. That's why we're here. So you can visit the website, you can email us, you can submit a TA request through our website. We'll actually put that in the chat so you have that. And we are part of the Tribal Law and Policy Institute, which I didn't get to say at the very beginning, but that's the organization that we're a part of, and Judge Garrow serves as a consultant to TLPI, and so I'm very happy to have her on today. I see some questions coming in. Jacob, I'll let you read the questions and I'll put a few links in the chat.
Janelle asks, what are some common themes we see in the community in terms of family dynamics, and what kind of harm is coming from the youth?
Ooh, so the things that I've seen, and I'm sure many of you have seen, and Jacob and Anna, feel free to jump in. Certainly see learned behaviors from parents, whether it's domestic violence or substance use. Also, one of the things that I've seen is learning that, because a lot of our parents and grandparents did not have good experience in the school system. Grandparents and sometimes parents in boarding schools, parents in a public school system who was not welcoming to Indigenous people. And so there's not a lot of support with getting to school and understanding why it might be important, and supporting that youth while they're in school, and even from a little teeny tiny age. I was just talking with someone about a very young child. They're still in elementary school, and the child's struggling with reading, should probably be tested, to see if they have if they're dyslexic, but not a lot of support from the parents. And so the child's getting further behind. And right now that, the child's coping perfectly well, but it's going to get harder and harder as the child gets further behind, and my thought is we need to address those issues now before the child gets older and starts, the wrong crowd and picking up learn their behaviors, and get into trouble. So those are some things that I've seen. I don't know, Jacob and Anna, did you want to share anything?
I think the biggest takeaway from your discussion today, Judge Garrow, is that initial conversation with the participants and having that heart to heart with them from the beginning, because once you explain to them what the juvenile healing wellness court is composed of, then I feel like that confidentiality steps becomes easier. And in terms of what the youth are dealing with, I think a lot of it is people not having patience with them. And so it's on the team to have patience with the youth. That, you know, we're not going to be able to teach them what they need to learn in some cases in 6 to 9 months, however long the case lasts. So unfortunately, we might see the juvenile or the youth multiple times. But I think having that strength and that trust, building that trust, can ultimately lead to the change and the purpose the Healing and Wellness Court exists in the first place. And that's why that confidentiality is such a big component, because if word gets out in the smaller community that confidentiality is out the window, then your juvenile healing and wellness court is going to suffer. And unfortunately, you know, your parents won't advise their children to sign that confidentiality agreement because the trust will be broken.
Such a good point.
I think in response to that first part about family dynamics, I think it can vary, because I feel like there's youth who come into the program and they have that generational experience of seeing substance use in the home. But then you may have a youth who comes in and this might be kind of a last resort for a parent who really is involved and they care, but they're, you know, that youth for whatever reason is continuing to, you know, drink or use drugs. And so, you know, I think it's going to be individual to that, you know, why is this youth coming into this? But I mean, I think there's a lot of the time we look at a lack of family engagement or just a lack of supervision in the home. Sometimes that's what's coming up. So I can't say across the board, this is the reason, or this is why this youth is coming into the wellness court. But I know that we do want to encourage family engagement, regardless, because you want that involvement, you want that parent being supported, you want to support the whole family as part of the work. So important to consider all those relationships, which we'll talk about next time. So that's good, because we do have a whole section on that.
Yeah. And you both made me think about having measured expectations, right? If your youth graduates from healing to wellness, you know, we're not expecting the Lifetime movie ending, right? Where now all of a sudden that family's, you know, just wonderful, and all the challenge. You may only you know, change one little thing about that youth's life. But that one little adjustment in the direction of that youth's life might have a huge impact 20 years down the road, and you just don't know that. And maybe the only thing that the youth took away from healing, from your juvenile healing to wellness, is they know some people care about them. So now they have some constant figures, and maybe even if they weren't successful, they at least know people cared and can come back and you know, talk to that individual. And I think that has an impact on the youth, is to temper our expectations, but to not give up. You know, we're not going to we're going to Disney World when we graduate type and everything's perfect. As much as we'd love to.
Well, I think we have reached our time together today. So we want to thank Judge Garrow for session 1, and we're going to look forward to session 2. As part of the Tribal Youth Resource Center, we just want to thank you all for spending some time with us today. And we are here as a support to you and your community. So please do reach out if you're in need of any training or just support in general for all the youth services that you're providing. We have a team that is across the country and from different tribal communities. And so I'm happy to be here and serve as a support. Next slide. I believe there's an evaluation link that was placed in the chat. So appreciate if you all could fill that out because it does help us improve the way that we work and the future trainings that we offer. So please feel free to fill out the evaluation link. And I think we can go to the closing slide. All right, I am going to close this out. So I want to thank all of you, wish all of you continued health and safety in your communities. And we are looking forward to a better 2022. But I will close this out in a prayer. Misi, give her a breath. Thank you so much for today, for all of these individuals, for the work that they're doing in their communities, and for the knowledge that was shared today. We pray your blessings and guidance in the work that they're doing and over their community members, their families, and the children that they're serving. And we look forward to the time when we're together again, Mido. Thank you.
Thank you.